to take a very different look at interoperability, and we are going to turn from the Department of Homeland Security and Project SAFECOM to a much more down on the street view and perspective. Craig deatley comes to us from the Washington Hospital Center. He serves as Deputy Director of the Institute for Public Health Emergency Readiness, and he's also an Associate Professor of Emergency Medicine at George Washington University. He works as a physician's assistant at Fairfax Hospital, a volunteer paramedic with the Fairfax County Fire and Rescue Department, where he's a member of the Urban Search and Rescue Team. He's also the team's medical team coordinator. Mr. deatley wears many hats, and we're going to have the benefit now of somebody who's a hands-on practitioner who has moved between the bioterror response scenario world and the interop issues that surround it. Not just looking at it from a policy standpoint, but looking at it from how communications, when they work, impact, and how communications, when they don't work, impact a team. So, without any further ado, and a little bit ahead of schedule here, would you please welcome Craig deatley.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Peter, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, Craig.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to join all of you this morning in this interesting and pertinent conversation about interoperability. In the brief period of time that I have been given, I'd like to talk in particular about community preparedness, interoperability, and the future. In the time that I've been given, I'd like to mention specifically some of the motivation that I have seen for current preparedness efforts, along with identifying some of the planning obstacles that communities have faced in the past, as well as perhaps on an ongoing basis, along with discussing interoperability and what is it that communities must do to ultimately achieve it, and then conclude by talking about what I see as some of the future efforts regarding planning and training in particular. As Peter alluded to, I've had a wonderful career both as a practicing paramedic with the Fairfax County Fire and Rescue Department and an emergency department physician assistant at 3 different types of emergency departments, and currently work as an administrator for the largest hospital in the Washington metropolitan area and one of the biggest in the country. And this is a facility that is very concerned about disaster preparedness. Also, through the years, I've had the opportunity to work as a consultant for several federal government agencies, including the Departments of Homeland Security and Health and Human Services and the Justice Department. And it's through this combination of experiences that I'd like to share some thoughts and ideas with you now. As I've looked back on preparedness through the years, I think that there's a number of things that have prompted communities to try and pay attention. One, of course, begins with a sense of responsibility. Up till recently, I think that sense of responsibility was most keenly felt by the public safety community, especially the fire departments throughout the United States, subsequently the police, and even the EMS community now. Since 9/11, I think that sense of responsibility has grown to include the health community, both from a healthcare facility perspective as well as from a public health department perspective too. Clearly, those communities that have experienced real-time incidents of some magnitude that tested their preparedness have benefited from that response activity. And for those communities that have only read or seen those real experiences, that too has, in some cases anyway, provided some impetus for better preparing on the chance that they may have a similar experience. Through the years, state expectations have been modified, and clearly since 9/11, more federal mandates have come down the road to promote preparedness. Even the insurance industries in their ISO ratings have expected more and more, both from an agency perspective and from an overall community perspective concerning preparedness. We've all had the public eye through the press and media lens expanded, in some cases with wonderful stories that give a good picture as opposed to incidents that didn't go as well, and hence the storylines became the other story beyond the incident itself. We have a better educated public, and as such their concerns about the level of preparedness and their expectations of all of us on being prepared have risen, particularly through the years and especially since 9/11. And now, of course, the latest impetus is that there is money more available now than ever before to help make sure that we are doing the right thing in a hopeful, timely manner. There are a number of obstacles that communities have faced and I believe still are facing. From an agency perspective, whether we talk about police, fire, EMS, hospitals, or public health, clearly each of us have our individual daily roles and responsibilities that keep us busy enough. We don't have time just to spend on disaster preparedness by itself. In many cases, whether you're a large community or small, there's a limited number of staff, and yet there's an unlimited number of needs that staff is expected to meet. Numerous meetings of all kinds require time and attention. As soon as we write one plan or procedure, that leads to a need potentially for additional plans and procedures to be written as well. And we're spending more time now, I think, on training than we've ever done before. And that has its consequences, not just from a cost and a logistics perspective, but also from potentially I'm getting tired of training attitude. We all have faced conflicts with time. How do we manage our 8-hour clock effectively? Well, probably the most often used practice is it's rare that an administrator within a public safety agency or even a healthcare facility these days is working just a 9-to-5 job. How can we become more proficient and efficient with that time is a continual challenge. We also are seeing, I think, in communities throughout America and certainly in the healthcare field as well, some of our most senior, our most experienced persons who've been there since the beginning now have reached the age of retirement and are jumping off the train, if you will, leaving the train still on the tracks but with a whole new set of engineers. Engineers who may not have that same degree of insight because their experience base hasn't been quite the same as their predecessors. How do we make up for that lack of experience when the threats and the needs are still present is another challenge that we all face. In many communities, large, medium, as well as small, have continually faced budget constraints of one kind or another. And while federal dollars have become available, they sometimes are onerous in the amount of paperwork that must be prepared and presented, the time that takes for it to be processed by state and federal officials, and even more importantly, the time it takes for that money finally to get to the agency's bank, so to speak. Now, what about our state of preparedness? That's certainly part of a national debate that begins really at a local level. I think we would all agree that since 9/11 especially, but not just since 9/11, federal monies have been appropriated and are beginning to be distributed with a bit greater efficiency than what we saw early on. From a pre-hospital care perspective, the Office of Domestic Preparedness is a prime source of our funding, whereas the healthcare community is deriving much of its resources from both the CDC as well as HRSA. But our state of preparedness isn't simply going to be predicated on more and more money. It's also going to be improved because we, at the local level especially, are given more guidance because time is of the essence and we don't have experience, real experience in many cases in dealing with domestic preparedness issues and terrorism response. The more we can have expert guidance given to us from a state and federal perspective, the better our preparedness is going to be overall as well. Clearly the money has been spent on a number of fronts, including to buy more levels of protection, to buy newer and better detection and monitoring devices, and yes, a lot of money has been spent on training different personnel. And we've had more exercises since 9/11 than probably any other period of time in our history. And as a result, we have an awful lot of potential lessons that we have learned, but the question is, how have we codified them? And are they being evaluated in a similar sense so that we truly do get a real picture, not only of what our local level of preparedness is, but what our national level of preparedness is as well, some would suggest that we haven't done as well as we need to do in this area of both effective exercising on the one hand and appropriate and effective evaluation on the other. Now, through the exercise programs that have been conducted at a local, state, and federal level, I think we could all agree there's numerous lessons that have been learned to date. Here are perhaps just a few of them. It's been my observation, and I don't think it's mine alone, that while we have placed more time and effort on planning and exercising, there's still in many communities a lack of clear understanding of what each agency's roles and responsibilities really are and how do they integrate with one another, especially in a public health emergency. Incident management systems, while in principle have been universally recognized as needed, they have not as universally been understood, are not as well rehearsed or perfected in many communities, large and small, especially when it pertains to trying to use them during a public health emergency, such as an anthrax outbreak or a ricin release. And while money has been spent to buy a lot of things, many communities have not directly benefited yet from that money being available, and hence their inventories are limited. Even those communities that have received federal funds to date have put forth the argument that more money is needed to buy additional ensembles and monitoring and detection devices and the like. Lessons that have been learned also have pointed out that it's one thing for an agency to have their own response plan, but in this world of mutual aid response, we haven't necessarily seen well-developed and well-executed written agreements that make sure that all of the right parties have come to the table and have an agreement in principle. And while we have done more planning than ever before, we haven't necessarily in every community completed all of our planning, and in some cases, perhaps too many cases, the planning that has been done is familiar to some, but not necessarily to everyone who will be responsible for using them. We are certainly training more now, as I mentioned before, than ever before, and that has its benefits clearly. But I'm concerned, and I think there's others too, that we may reach a point where we have done so much training and are evaluating ourselves with perhaps not as much objectivity as we might, and hence it leads to both an overconfidence or a complacency about the importance of a continued effort. Or, as I mentioned earlier as well, I've been to some communities that feel that they've trained so much they are reaching a training fatigue. Both training too much and too little obviously has its implications. Other lessons that have been learned clearly get down to the nitty-gritty level. Many communities still are trying to find the best way to do decon for mass populations or patients who are non-ambulatory or patients with special needs. We're still struggling in some communities with how best to triage, treat, and transport large numbers of victims in a timely and efficient manner. We're still also trying to find what is the most cost-effective way to conduct medical surveillance and what are the parties that should be engaged in this medical surveillance effort. Also, how do we locate patients, not just on an incident scene, but as they go through the course of the entire response system? And also, what is the right way? What is the proper message format? Who is the right messenger to both provide a public information, if not public education campaign, both before an incident as well as during and after? We still can't, or in some cases won't, communicate with one another as well as we need to. And while everybody agrees that unified command is what's necessary on large-scale incidents, in some cases there are still communities that believe that unified command amounts to the equivalent of circling all of the different agency command posts in a common location, as opposed to having adequate representation at a single location. A lot of attention has rightfully been paid to protecting the public. But there's also lessons that have been learned about how are we not adequately taking care of ourselves. Do our EMS and our law enforcement agencies, not just our fire and hazmat personnel, have the right levels of PPE, and are they properly trained to wear it? Also of importance is for our entire system, do we have qualified, well-trained mental health professionals to help us deal not only with the public, but to help us in our response activities, both in the short and the long term? And do we have the plans in place that will assure that we can be vaccinated or medicated in a timely and effective fashion, not just the public that we serve? A lot of emphasis has been placed on response, but lessons have pointed out that we need to be spending more time on the recovery aspects of system restoration. Now, the buzzword for this particular conference clearly centers around interoperability. And as Dr. Boyd pointed out, interoperability isn't just about technology and its optimum uses. It's not just about making sure that everybody, as an example, can talk on a common radio channel. While technology has an importance, the critical aspect of interoperability begins with making sure that we have integrated the right people at all levels in everything that we do, whether it's planning, training, or exercising. Interoperability, or the community that practices interoperability or promotes it, clearly is a community that will have spent time standardizing key aspects of planning and response, to include terminology, the procedures themselves, even down to including the documentation that we individually and collectively need to be preparing and submitting. Interoperability in the end leads to not only an optimum identification of what are our community resources, but the best coordination of these resources, both initially as well as during the long-term response efforts. Now, as I conclude my presentation, I think there are some changes that are coming down the road for preparedness. They will center around, as an example, more and more emphasis not on response, but rather on prevention and deterrence through better intelligence gathering and more effective and timely sharing of intelligence information amongst all of the response community, not just the law enforcement element. Number two, I think you will see more and more emphasis being placed on regional planning, not simply individual agency or individual community plans by itself, but a community as part of a larger geographic area. Third, I think that they will continue, or we will continue to see more standardization of exercise evaluation, clearly through ODP efforts of their HC program. Through this more standardized and objective means of evaluation of our exercises, we'll have a better means of not only identifying what the community strengths and weaknesses are, but what our national strengths and weaknesses are as well. And those pieces of data, that composite of information, can now lead to more wisely expenditure of dollars down the road. Last but not least, I think we will also see more and more use of computers and even the internet for presenting virtual incidents for us to develop our management skills at, and no longer have to rely solely on the live functional exercise or even the traditional tabletop by itself. In summary, clearly we have spent and will continue to spend a lot of money on preparedness. With that money, a number of improvements are being seen, including a lot more gizmos and gadgets coming online and being available to communities large and small. We are seeing in many, but not necessarily all communities, more conversation amongst the key response elements. And that conversation also moves on to including joint training and exercises being done. And as a result of all of this, many communities are progressing in their improvement. But as we all know, preparedness is a marathon and not a sprint. Peter, my time is up, I believe, so I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Craig. You hit the time requirement right on the button there. And at the same time, if you could, just for purposes of review, would you back up to the slide you had on interoperability, the one that began not just common radio channels, please? I just want to fix on that slide, if we could, for a moment. And if you can't, don't worry about it. We can navigate around it.
You should have it in front of you now.
Yeah, great, thanks. Oops. I want that slide just to hold for those who are viewing this to get a sense as to what Craig's thoughts are about interoperability. And again, it's not just about common radio channels. It's the integration of the right personnel at all levels and everything being done, standardization of terminology, procedures and documentation, coordination of all the various resources. That's really hitting the nail on the head. If you had been watching our first Heading Down the Right Road presentation in November of 2002, we spent virtually all the time talking about the technologies involved. We looked at wireless, we looked at satellite, we looked at migration paths from a technology standpoint. But again, as far as coordinating all the various resources, all the personnel, all the various agencies in a multi-agency response, we didn't really touch on that. So in this session, we're going to talk less about the technology of communications and more about the organizational dynamics. That is, when you go to that handy-talkie and you push the call button, what happens? How does the whole response glue together? How do you sustain it? And that's one of the things in the public health scenarios we see here, by the way, is a lot more emphasis on a longer-term approach. So Craig, thank you for bringing that slide back up. And now let me get into a few questions. Over this past year, the governor of Maine asked me to serve on a working group that was specifically targeting the issue of how do we better alert and warn the deaf and hard of hearing. And we will talk about vulnerable populations in greater detail shortly, later on this morning. But, in terms of how we're going to reach out to these populations in particular, those with special needs, those that we can't locate. Craig, I know that, again, as I said a moment ago, we are going to drill down into that a bit more, but with groups like the Partnership for Public Warning, issuing reports recently that state that the entire warning and alert apparatus in the country, such as EAS, needs further work, needs to be developed and matured. What is your view of the status of the alert and warning system as it pertains to preparedness and response?
Well, I think that the alert and warning system needs to be one that has a blend of practicality, insight, and usefulness. Towards that end, my family, as an example, and many of my friends know that there's a color system out there, but they can't quote chapter and verse what each of the different steps mean, and I'm not sure that the public should, in fact. At the same time as there are different colors to indicate different levels, the fact is that there is only so much ramping up that each of our communities can do beyond what we're doing now on a daily basis. I mean, we hear on the one hand the importance of vigilance and constant preparedness, and there's a concerted effort across all of the communities in America, especially the public safety and healthcare and emergency management and public health disciplines to be ever so much vigilant. So what are we supposed to do now that we go from one level to the next isn't as clear. The other point of importance, I think, is that there are significant financial implications, not just PR implications related to both the system itself as well as what is to happen as we progress up or down the scale.
So just how well prepared are we at this point?
Oh, that's the golden question that every reporter would like to have the answer to. And my answer is that compared to the past, I think that we are farther along in preparedness. Compared to the future, we have a long road still to go.
And how would you characterize, for example, you were emphasizing a moment ago the regional nature of what we have to do now. We have to get away from, local compartmentalized types of approaches and get more regional in our thinking. And to that extent, how are the federal state regionalization efforts shaping up?
Well, I think that there's a recognition of its importance. I think there's an acceptance of the basic concepts, and I think you'll see different degrees of success as you go from state to state. I was in Indiana last week for an exercise, and there you clearly have a relationship between state emergency management and local emergency management, and that state is trying to further improve upon the relationship of state public health with each of its local public health departments. And yet in an SNS or a mass prophy exercise, it's not just individual discipline relationship, state and local, that's important, but it's the composite. And I think that we'll only see improvement, we'll only see the desired performance when we continue the efforts, not just at discipline development, but by multidisciplinary integration.
And coming as you do from the greater Washington area, you obviously have resources that many areas do not have. You have CAPWIN, you have all kinds of programs in place. How would you characterize the status of the implementation of ICS now? I don't want to get too broad in my questioning here, but I think obviously large urban departments have adjusted to it, have addressed it, have incorporated it. What about the rest of us?
Well, I think, again, you have the Beltway and then you have the other part of the United States. Clearly in the Beltway, we've had our share of large-scale incidents that have pointed out the shortfalls in not having an integrated approach, as well as the methods that need to be employed on how to achieve that goal. And I think that you will find other communities, the Milwaukee, Wisconsins, the Greensboro, North Carolinas is two examples that I personally visited. They recognize that there needs to be an integration effort. They are forming coalition of the different disciplines. They are trying to conduct meaningful meetings that lead to response procedures and commonality. But as I said, this is not something that we take a concerted effort for a short period of time and we're over and done. It's going to be continued. We have to build on the lessons that have been learned and make sure that those lessons that have been learned are shared not only by us at the local level or at the state level, but across these United States as well.
And do you see some sort of forum, a virtual forum such as this? We've attempted now, in this Heading Down the Right Road series to drive the virtual forum. We're using the access grid, for example. Do you see this as something that has promise? And where are we in terms of using virtual resources? You mentioned virtual exercising a moment ago. Do we need to put a lot more energy into this type of activity at this point?
Well, I think this is just one more tool that we need to have in different sizes and make sure that it's in everybody's tool chest. Video conferencing is a wonderful tool, but it needs to be available in Mount Vernon, Iowa, and not simply in Washington, D.C. And we need to make sure that as we identify needs, we recognize some of these needs can only be met using certain strategies, including virtual reality, but not necessarily all of them.
By the way, if anyone would like to, we do have email access for questions from remote sites. Let me just give you the email address one more time. It's GM, as in George Markowski, at umcs.maine.edu. And I think this idea of contingency planning, the thin rank issue, if you will. We have well-qualified, well-trained, dedicated healthcare professionals who are going to, whether they're participating as part of a DMAT or what have you, play a very important role in whatever we might confront. But at the same time, as you look at the biohealth scenarios of the past, you see things playing out over a much longer period. And even with SARS, for example, and I don't want to just focus on SARS, but you see the fact that once it's in motion, it takes a considerable amount of time to resolve. And the impact of that in terms of preparation on personnel. Craig, do you think that that's being addressed adequately?
No, and I think that's an important point that you're making, Peter. As I mentioned in my presentation, a lot of time, effort, and money has been spent on the response phase, less on the recovery phase, and few communities have realistically looked, in fact, also at what are the implications of extended operations. Extended in this case isn't 12 to 24 hours, but as we saw with SARS in Canada, goes on for not even weeks, but in fact goes on for months. So the whole issue of extended operations, what are the elements, what are the solutions to the problems that we identify, needs to have more time and attention in many communities, including my own, I might add.
And also from the training standpoint, I mean, we do have sort of the first team. We constantly see the first team. Do we see enough of the second and third team? Those people who may have to step up and play an important role, are they being addressed? Are their needs in terms of, what they need to know from the interoperability standpoint, for example, the ICS standpoint? Is that something that we need to pay more attention to?
Well, that's part of extended operational planning, and to answer your question specifically, I think many communities have focused a lot of their efforts at the first line of senior management and middle management because that's the natural thing to do, if not practically the easiest thing to do. And it's the right thing to start with, but on the other hand, these individuals aren't going to go 24/7 for very long. We have to make sure that there's a second, third, fourth, maybe even a fifth tier of expertise that's available to step in to be both a performer on the one hand or a leader on the other.
Well, Craig, we're moving along at a much quicker pace. We're a little bit ahead of schedule. I want to give you one more opportunity if you want to share anything with us before we sign off here and move on to our next venue. By the way, we will be talking to somebody out in Indiana. If you want to send any messages to that team, feel free to do so.
Well, please give my best to Peter, and I have no doubt that he will have also some sage advice and some good insight to share during his presentation. I think in closing, one, thank you for the opportunity to participate. And number two, again, I think that this is an important effort and one that I would like to see continued, and is one of really just a series of educational forums that could continue to serve an important role in our overall preparedness efforts.